I always find it curious when our gospel reading ends with a line like, "There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth," and we all say, "Thanks be to God." For most people, talking about money in church is almost as fun as talking about politics at Thanksgiving dinner. I'm not exactly sure why we shy away from talking about money in church. My experience of talking about money, frankly, with many of you has felt almost like a relief sometimes. Like we're all kind of secretly wondering how our relationship to what we have impacts our relationships with God and with each other. And we secretly wonder about this because we modern Americans have such a conflicted understanding of possession and wealth and ownership. But Jesus never shied away from talking about money. In fact, he talked about money a lot. He knew that our relationship to what we have directly impacts our relationships to God and to the world around us, which in my mind makes church the perfect place to have the tough conversations that we need to have about money. Curiously, in this season of gratitude, our assigned gospel reading for today is all about money. Money, 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 the parable of the talents. You know the story. A man carefully selects 3 slaves in whom he entrusts a certain amount of money, and he leaves town. He's gone a long, long time, and eventually he returns to examine the result of his great experiment. 2 of the 3 have taken the ball and run with it, made some risky investments that paid off, and the 3rd one carefully guarded the money he was given to be sure that he could return at least the original amount. The master commended the first 2 slaves for taking a risk, investing what was entrusted to them, putting it to work. The 3rd slave, well, unhappy would be an understatement for how the master felt about him. His decision to hide the money he was given sent the master into a rage, and he threw the 3rd employee, the 3rd slave, into hell, and that is the end. Now, there are many, many ways to interpret this parable, of course, and it's usually likely that the easy interpretation is the wrong one. Scholar Amy Jill Levine says that we have a tendency to domesticate Jesus' provocative parables to ensure our own comfort, and I think that she's right. But I've decided to go this morning with the traditional interpretation of the parable, where the master is God and we are the slaves, even though I have strong doubts about whether Jesus intended the story to be interpreted this way. I wonder about this primarily because the master in this story is a terrible person. He's greedy and selfish. He reaps where he doesn't sow. He's unkind, and he doesn't think twice about using systems and power to hurt vulnerable people. To me, that doesn't sound like God. Honestly, it sounds more like the president. Still, there's plenty in this traditional interpretation to make you and me think very hard about how we live in the world with what we have. And it's good every now and then to talk about money in church. Let's begin here. Imagine the people standing on the hillside that day, listening to Jesus launch into yet another "the kingdom of God is like" story. Years of listening to this story may have numbed us to what actually happened when Jesus began telling this story, because I don't think that you and I fully appreciate the vast amount of money that Jesus is talking about when he talks about a talent. A talent was the largest measurement of money there was in Jesus' day. An actual physical talent was a big chunk of metal that took several people to lift. It was the equivalent of, say, about $1 million to you and me. Jesus' listeners' eyes would have widened in amazement as he talked, and they would have been almost unable, as would we, to get their minds around the idea of someone walking up to them and handing them 15 years of salary. Not to mention the other 2 who received unthinkable, even larger, lottery-sized allotments. Maybe Jesus did that to jar his listeners with an adjustment of perspective, and I sure think that you and I could use one too. This week I logged onto an internet site called globalrichlist.com. On that website, you can put in your salary, and you are automatically ranked on a scale of every single person in the world. You can see instantaneously where you fall in the mix. Now, I would never immediately think of myself as rich. I have bills to pay, I have 2 kids in college, and I worry about money more than I should. So you can imagine my surprise when I discovered that I fall within the top 0.1% of the entire population of the world when it comes to income. In other words, there are 5,989,122,435 people in the world who are poorer than I am. In still other words, there are over 4 billion people in this world, 4 billion, who live on less money per day than the couple of bucks that I often drop several times a week on a cup of coffee. I wonder about the slave in Jesus' parable who surveyed what he had. As his boss laid the check in his hands, he must have glanced out of the corner of his eye at the other 2 slaves. Sure, I mean, he was just handed $1 million, but look at what they had. Compared to them, he was downright poor. Never mind that what he held in his hand was more money than almost every person in his community could even imagine having in one place at one time. All of a sudden, what he held in his hand seemed frightfully small. And that perception of scarcity, well, it just shut him down. Which is why our holy text talks so frankly about how much you and I give away. Because giving is a spiritual practice that shapes and forms our hearts and our lives. It's a biblical standard called tithing, giving 10% of your income back to God. That's a lot of money. And I know the defensiveness that everyone's feeling right at this moment, because the average American gives 2% of her income to charity, to all charities, not just the church, every year. Why? Well, times are hard, you know? Exorbitant is a kind word for the price of housing in this town. Try obscene or criminal. And have you seen the price of health insurance? And with the viability of Social Security looking more and more dubious, all of us need to be saving for retirement like we never have before. And all of these things are true. But you and I, we're paying rent and saving for retirement here in one of the richest countries on the planet. We have sinfully restructured our reality in terms of what we perceive that we don't have instead of the incredible abundance with which we've been showered. Note that you and I are not paying rent or healthcare premiums in a village near Darfur, Sudan, where our days would be filled with worries like, I hope my kids have something to eat today, or I wonder if my child will ever be able to go to school, or I know I will die very soon because I cannot get medication for my AIDS infection. We have so much money. We have so many things. We have so much more than we need. But sometimes, like the 3rd slave in Jesus' story, we manage to bury it in necessities that we use to define our lives, but which in the end add up to a whole lot of nothing. Don't you think that the master who has entrusted us with this incredible abundance is wondering what on earth we are doing with what we have? In this whole wide created world, you and I have an excess amount of everything we want and so much more than we need. It is sinful to live our lives individually or corporately with a narrative of scarcity in which we think so much more with longing about what we don't have instead of with gratitude for the abundance we do. But you can't hoard what you have and keep it forever like the third slave tried to do. And do you know why? Because it isn't yours to begin with. It's God's. God has placed in our hands unbelievable gifts of generosity and grace, of riches and abundance. We could choose to live gratefully, embracing the opportunity to be instrumental and life-changing partners in the work of God, to bring the kingdom of God to this earth right now, to care generously and tenderly for our neighbors. Or we could shackle our hearts to the rock of ownership, and we could live our lives desperately fearful of losing what wasn't even ours to begin with. This is a true story. There was a man who lived his life really on the edge of poverty. He worked as a plumber his whole entire career, and now, nearing 75 years old, he was still hard at work, trying every day to eke out a living. One evening, he was driving home from work when his truck was stopped on the highway by a Wells Fargo armored truck that had overturned in the middle of the road. The sight before him was chaos. There was money flying through the air. There were bags of money spilled on the highway. So the man pulled over, hurriedly scooped up one of the bags, and turned around and went home a different way. When he got home, he opened the bag, and there was $100,000 in the bag, cash. And he stacked those bills up carefully on his scratched Formica kitchen table, and he began to think about all the things he could do with that money. His unreliable truck that motored along at almost 200,000 miles could be replaced. He might even be able to take a real vacation for the first time he could remember, and retirement, always out of reach, suddenly seemed like a possibility. So all night long, he tossed with this moral dilemma. Out of all the people who could have found this money, he was really a rather deserving guy. He lived a good life. He hadn't been able to get a leg up no matter how hard he tried. He could really, justify keeping the money. But as the morning dawned, the man finally got out of bed and gathered the money together sadly. Well, he could really use it. The fact of the matter was that money belonged to somebody else. So he set off to return the money at the police station down the road. When he walked into the police station, he learned that while all of that money had spread all over the highway, not one person had yet come forward to return any of it. He was the first. And when a Wells Fargo representative walked in, the man handed him the money, explaining, "I knew I had to return this. It doesn't belong to me." Thanking him, the Wells Fargo manager took the money out of the bag and counted it as the plumber turned to leave. Then he stopped the plumber and matter-of-factly handed him $90,000 in cash. And he said, "We were only expecting to recover about 10% of the money. The rest is yours. Thank you for your honesty." One day that man had nothing. The next day he had $90,000 out of the blue. What would happen if we lived looking at what we have like that? What if we really lived fully knowing the truth that everything we have belongs to God? How would that change things? All of a sudden, the amount we have left after giving 10% back to God will look like a whole pile of undeserved abundance, which, of course, it is. So welcome to church, where this morning we're having an uncomfortable conversation about money. Money, 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 money. If you are giving nothing back to God, then you need to go back and read the parable of the talents. Each of us has been entrusted with gifts far beyond what we need. Take a dose of reality and face the fact that nothing you have belongs to you. God is waiting for your response. If you like to come to worship, you like the service and the people, sermons are a little sketchy, but You like for things to continue as they are, and you will affirm those feelings by reaching into your pocket when the plate comes around, pulling out a couple of bucks, tossing them in the offering plate. Well, you might be giving with a degree of self-interest that indicates that you are not being fully honest about how much you have. You're kind of buying into a fast food religion. Cheap food, questionable nutrition, convenient service, in and out, doesn't really hurt all that much, but not much in your life is changing, is it? You're eating at McDonald's when you could be eating steak every night. Look around you and start to be realistic about what you have, and then respond with thanksgiving. If you are giving regularly, a generous amount, you have reached a stage where you realize that on some level God has given you many blessings. You're finally starting to get the picture of the extreme generosity of God and the excess with which your life is marked. You are giving in gratitude and recognition of those blessings, but your dose of reality is that you might be still struggling with ownership. You're giving a sizable amount, but that amount is controlled by you and dictated by the financial limitations that you choose to put on your life. Last time you checked, God's name was not on the signature line of your mortgage, and you have car payments and other really important expenses to take care of. Guess what? None of it is yours anyway. You don't really own any of it. I don't really own any of it. What a sense of freedom I could have if I actually started living as if that were true. If you're tithing, if you're giving away a full 10% of your income or more, then you have reached a giving level of obedience. How much you give is not an agonizing decision every month. Rather, your giving is a regular commitment, a spiritual practice. You know how very much you have, and you know that it all belongs to God. Your regular tithe is a discipline of faith. And when you do that, you're perhaps beginning to get a glimpse of the fact that there is only more possibility of what God can do with what you have. If we could learn to see what we have and who we are in those terms, well, then fear would no longer drive us. We would live with spiritual vision and foresight. We would be free from the oppressive constructs of scarcity and fear. We would have no illusions about ownership. It all belongs to God anyway. And participation in the vision of what can be as the kingdom of God comes to be in the world seems like a more worthy investment than anything else I can possibly think of. Everybody hates to talk about money in church. I think we need to do it more often. Because I think God is waiting, just waiting for you and me to loosen our grasp on the tiny bits of this vast and wonderful world that we think we own, to become a part of something so much bigger and better, so vast and far-reaching, so abundant and full of promise, so that you and I are controlled finally not by our money, but by all the possibilities that God dreams for this world. As you're thinking this week about gratitude, I want to invite you to take some time to think about what you have and whether the fear of losing what you have limits God's work in your life. If you try this exercise, you will feel uncomfortable, which is exactly what Jesus intended the first time he told the parable of the talents. And if you allow yourself to be changed by that discomfort, well, the sky is the limit. Just imagine how the kingdom of God might begin coming to real and radiant life right here, right now. starting with you. May it be so. Amen.